with Rambo. He was born in Kitchener, Ontario, Canada. And at the age of 17, he became a fan of the classic TV series Route 66, about two young men in a Corvette convertible traveling the U.S. in search of America and themselves. The scripts by Sterling Silliphant combined action with ideas and so impressed Mr. Morrell that he decided to become a writer. He has a PhD in American literature from Penn State and was a professor in the English department at the University of Iowa. Some of his bestsellers include the classic spy novel, The Brotherhood of the Rose, as well as many others. He's an Edgar and Anthony finalist, and Nero and McCavity winner, and is also the recipient of 3 Bram Stoker Awards from the Horror Writers Association and the prestigious Thriller Master Award from the International Thriller Writers Organization. And he currently lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Welcome.
Welcome, thank you. Some greetings to fellow Robin Murphy fans.
Well, I thought we would start out first, David, if you don't mind. Just tell us a little bit about yourself that I didn't mention.
Sure. You did mention one of the things that's extremely important to me. I was born in southern Ontario, Canada, in a twin city called Kitchener-Waterloo, which at that time was about 50,000 people. And for if some of you who know Canada, it's about an hour's drive from Toronto. And when I was 17, I saw that television show that you mentioned, Route 66. And it was about these 2 young men in a Corvette convertible, and it was distinguished in a lot of interesting ways. One was that it was filmed entirely on location. And for you Texans, it was frequently filmed in various locations in Texas, because in Dallas, for example, I think in part what they would do is they were very seldom on the actual highway, Route 66. They went down the East Coast and then across the very southern part of the United States to avoid winter weather. And then they would go up the Pacific side and then in the summer go across the northern part of the country. And the idea was that they would go to different communities and there'd be some action. It was not a mystery story. It was a drama with action involved. And I watched the show by accident. I just happened to sit down and watch it, but it had been unlike anything I had seen before because I believed the people in it. And more than that, the dialogue was very thought-inspiring, even though there was a lot of action. And I noticed after a number of episodes, I realized that almost all of them were written by the same person, a man who had a very distinctive name, Sterling Silliphant. And Sterling eventually went on to receive an Oscar for adapting John Ball's novel In the Heat of the Night. And he also was known as the king of the disaster movies because he wrote The Poseidon Adventure and The Towering Inferno. But in those days he was writing for television, also a show called Naked City. And in one of those moments, I said, he had such an influence on me that I said, wouldn't it be wonderful to have that kind of influence? And I wrote him a letter. I couldn't type at the time. It was a handwritten letter. And if there are any librarians in the audience, I always like to single them out because a librarian made me where I went. And at the end of each episode of Route 66, there would be a voice that said, "This has been a presentation of Screen Gems, a division of Columbia Pictures." Well, I went to the library with my letter, and I said, I remember my body language. I was shaking my head this way. I don't suppose you know how to get in touch with Screen Gems. You know how it's sort of negative body language. And the librarian looked at me with a smile and said, "Just a moment," and she went away, and about a minute later she came back with the address. And I sent my letter to Sterling. We became great friends eventually, and he responded with a double-sided letter that was single-spaced, in which he basically told me what to do in order to become a writer. And at bottom, it was a very simple thing. He said, if you're meant to be a writer, you will write and write and write and write and write. And eventually you'll find other people who are doing what you're doing, and you'll learn from them. And eventually, if you have something to say, you will find someone who can help you. And basically, that's how it happened. It took me 10 years from that moment before I was working on the novel First Blood, which is one reason why we're here. Just to leap forward, a part of the moral of this story, there's two morals. One is the librarian, whom we never know who will help us, and how much we help others even though we don't know it. And the other moral is that he was generous enough, this extremely successful writer, to take time out of his schedule to write that 2-page letter, which I still have. I got a special frame so it has a glass on both sides, and I have it on a shelf behind me. And anyway, to skip forward, in 1985, many years later, I happened to have the opportunity to get in touch with him, and I reminded him of, we had other letters we exchanged, and he said, we've never met, and by then the Rambo movies were out, so, in Hollywood, any connection you can make, so Sterling, wanted to meet me. So he invited me to visit him in Los Angeles, and I came out and spent the 4th of July weekend with him, and he said, what are you working on now? And I said, last year I had a spy novel called Brotherhood of the Rose, and the paperback just came out, and I had a copy of it, and I gave it to him, and he took it to NBC and said, you guys should be doing action miniseries, because you're always doing soap operas. So NBC purchased the book, and he was the executive producer on the miniseries, which featured Robert Mitchum, Peter Strauss, Connie Selica, and David Morse. That miniseries remains to this day the only miniseries that ever premiered after a Super Bowl. Now, I have many friends who have been #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, which I have not been, although I've been on the list, but not #1. And they can do that, but I tell you, every week there's a new #1, but there's only one person who can say he had a miniseries after the only one after the Super Bowl. So anyway, I hope if you interrupt me, go ahead, because if I'm interesting, I'll keep going. I eventually also realized that it was very difficult to earn a living as a writer. And so I decided to go into academia, and I had read a book by a Hemingway scholar named Philip Young. And he wrote, it's hard to imagine an academic writing exciting prose. But he was amazing in his way of making it exciting to read literature. And he was teaching at Penn State, and I was then married, newly married. We had an infant daughter, and my wife taught history at a high school, and I was finishing my BA, and I remember the night I went home, and I finished the Philip Young Hemingway book, and I said, what would you think if after, no, she was pregnant. That I know now, I remember. She was pregnant, and I said, what would you think if after the baby comes, you quit your job? And we'll immigrate to the United States so I can study with Philip Young. And I remember she said, sure, let's go. And because we both had that Route 66 mentality of hitting the road and seeing where we could go. So we went to Penn State, and I eventually became a graduate assistant to Philip Young. And when his wife died, my wife became his housekeeper. And it was money we desperately needed. And I was getting my master's at the time. And so this person, we had pulled up stakes to travel to the United States for me to study with him. He became like a second father to me, a lot like Sterling did. And for a year, we ate dinner with him every night.
Wow.
And there are, I was in the academic world for a long time, and there are a few stories about how a student became so close to a professor. Anyway, I kept writing, and at Penn State there was a writing teacher whose name was Philip Klass. His pen name was William Tenn, and he was a science fiction writer, and he agreed to help me. And he made it very difficult for me. He had me writing, which was what Sterling had me doing. And eventually his agent came to visit him, Philip Klass, when Philip for the first time bought a house. He'd been he'd been in New York and he'd been a lot of places, and then he's in Penn State, and he thought, I'm gonna buy a house. So he had a house for me, and Henry Morrison, his agent, showed up, and Philip said, there were two Philips, but Philip Klass said, tell Henry you're above first blood. And I did, and Henry said, okay, I'm sold. When you finish it, send it to me. So I had jumped over a lot of hurdles, and the book was published when I was 29. And I think my mouse is doing strange things. So the book was published when I was 29, and I had a very amazing career. It remains in print. In 1972 it was published, and this is its 51st anniversary.
Wow.
And it has never been out of print, and it's been in 31 languages, and it's the 5 movies.
That's awesome.
So I talked a long time there, but you did ask.
No, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Well, let's open it up a little bit to some questions from the audience.
At Penn State, did he minor in psychology? Just going from your writing, trying to figure that out.
Okay, at Penn State, did you minor in psychology, or did you just kind of figure that out along the way?
You mean what was my major? My specialty was American literature,
okay.
Which is a very strange thing for a Canadian to be pursuing. And in fact, it's the reason why I remained in the United States. When I finished my degrees, I have a doctorate in American literature, and I had planned to go back to Canada. What had happened in 1967, Canada celebrated its centennial. And the celebration occurred in Montreal with a week-long extravaganza called Expo 67. And until then, Canadians often saw themselves as an undeclared state of the United States, with the influence of American culture. But after 1967, there was a strong movement to understand Canadian culture and history. And so in 1970, when I applied to Canadian universities to teach American literature, I might as well have been applying to the moon, because there was absolutely no reason for them to hire me. So I wound up, unfortunately, being accepted as a professor at the University of Iowa, and I've been in the United States ever since. We are naturalized citizens, my wife and I, and for what it's worth, it's difficult to become a citizen. I know this is a topic, to do, especially with Texas, which is a border state, but we found it very difficult, as you have to travel to a government building which is capable of granting citizenship. And where we were in Iowa City, the nearest one was in Nebraska, which was a 5-hour drive away. And we made the drive periodically to try to set it up, but it became very complicated. And it's only when we moved to New Mexico, again a border state, where there are a lot of immigrants from Mexico, where I found a immigration attorney who could explain to us how this happened and how it would work. And there are 200 questions that immigrants must answer, and 20 of the 200, and they're often very detailed about the U.S. government. And we found the questions to be difficult, even though we've been living in the United States since 1966. But the attorney helped us get through it, and we became, all the years later, 1993 is when we finally became citizens. But proud to have done it and to have surmounted the difficulties.
I'm glad too.
Thank you.
You have a question?
Hi, David. This is Melissa, and I've obviously read Rambo and Me, and I'm fascinated. yes, that's the right person.
Terrific.
I am fascinated with the fact that Rambo was created because of your observance or experience with PTSD in the soldiers, and that the way
Yes.
that you presented that was very, very fascinating, and then in turn led the Audie Murphy influence into Rambo. And I think everybody here would really like to hear that story. Not everybody has a
Yes.
copy of that like I do.
And that which is why I'm here, essentially. So at Penn State, the department graciously, generously allowed me to earn some money by teaching introductory writing to first-year students, essay writing, how to research, and that sort of thing. And I, in one of my classes, realized that many of the students were young men who had returned from Vietnam. They were Vietnam veterans. Many of them had seen combat, and they were just a little younger than me. And they were looking at me. I mean, it's a natural reflex, you know, what gives you the right to tell us when we've been, you know, risking our lives? So I invited them to stay after class so we could chat about the difficulties they were having with me as an authority figure. And I explained to them what I just explained to you all, that I was at that time a Canadian, and I was married, and I had a young child, and there was no way the government would ever have put me in the military to fight in Vietnam. Moreover, you know, I'd just come to the country. It wasn't at all possible. But I said I was very interested to hear about their experiences. And so after class, they didn't all stay at once, but many of them did periodically, and they told me about the term post-traumatic stress disorder was not then current. And there were a shell shock, battle fatigue. These were some of the synonyms, which some of you I know are familiar with. And they began telling me about how they woke up from nightmares, and they had difficulty in relationships, and how loud noises made them dive to the ground or seek cover. How they drank too much, how there was drug use, self-medicating, so to speak, and the flashbacks. And this was a revelation to me, because in Canada, we never heard about the Vietnam War. I mean, it was you know, somebody else's, on the Canadian news, there might be a little bit of it, but on the American news, oh yes, it sometimes occupied 10 minutes of a say, Walter Cronkite broadcast on the CBS evening news. And so I learned an awful lot. I mean, this was revealing to me. And I had already had the idea, because of the news, the TV news, one particular broadcast had gripped me. And this would now be a little bit forward, 1968. 1968 was a big year in Vietnam, because that was the year of the Tet Offensive, in which the North Vietnamese organized and counterattacked in ways that no one had predicted. Well, in this country, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Robert Kennedy was assassinated. And the consequences of those two deaths, coupled with anti-war protests and civil rights protests, made it one of the most violent years domestically that the United States has ever seen. If we were in person, I'd do a big thing. I'd parade and I'd hold up my hands and all that. I can't quite do it here, but I'm going to do the rhetoric. There weren't 10 riots. There weren't 50 riots. There were not 100 riots. There were several hundred riots. And many cities, even today, have not recovered. Inner Detroit, Gary, Indiana, parts of Gary, Indiana, parts of Los Angeles, and so on. There are in some cities still blocks of abandoned buildings. And the riots, we had a few years ago several violent disturbances, let us say, that different parts of the political agenda had things to say about. That was nothing compared to what happened in 1968. Whole blocks were destroyed. Whole blocks of cars were destroyed. The National Guard or the state militia in various states actually were patrolling the streets. And I remember seeing on television these patrols next to gutted buildings and gutted vehicles. And then, Walter Cronkite was the person we watched, and some of you are of an age that you watch Walter Cronkite too. Mr. Believable is what Howard Cosell called it. And he switched to a firefight, doing it again, to a firefight in Vietnam. And I remember thinking, it's the same war. That if you didn't have somebody telling you what you were seeing, especially in Florida, where there were palm trees and vegetation that could be thought of as Asian in Vietnam, but if you didn't know better, it's all the same thing. And that's when the penny dropped, so to speak. And I don't know why this is. Every time I move, my mouse goes crazy. I remember thinking, what if a war veteran, someone who was really extraordinary, came back to the United States and received the Medal of Honor and decided to wander across the country to see what he'd been fighting for. And the idea was that he would wind up in a particular town in which you have to understand, and some of you are old enough to remember this, in the late 1960s, many males had hair down to here and had beards down to here. And I grew my mustache as part of a kind of method acting just to see what would happen with authority figures looking at me. And if you had long hair and a beard and you were, police hurled insults. People in authority, what are you, a man or a woman? Get your hair cut. And I personally was harassed, even though I only had a mustache. Now, what had made me think of all this was an event. I was going through some files the other day, and I actually found the newspaper clipping for it. An event that occurred in the American Southwest, and in fact it was in New Mexico, where I now live, where a band of hippies, as they were called, with usually not affection, by authority figures, had gone into this town and had been harassed. They had been taken to the police station. They had been forcibly shaved, forcibly had their hair cut off, and then had been basically taken out of town and said to keep going. And the nearest place was like 30 miles. And I remember, and here we get to our point here, I remember thinking, and he was on my mind, what would happen if Audie Murphy had been in Vietnam and came back and grew as he did? There are pictures of him with a beard, not the long hair, but let's say he did the full thing. And he, was wandering around, and the police decided to hassle him. Now again, this is not an anti-police story, but it is a cultural phenomenon that occurred at the time. And those of you who saw the Democratic National Convention on TV in Chicago in 1968, you saw this was a more violent version of what happened between war protesters who were hippies and the police, and it was very bad. And I thought, what would happen if Audie Murphy was in that position? So he became my model for the character. There have been a lot of people who have wondered if there was a real Rambo, and in fact there was somebody named Rambo in Vietnam. I gather his name is on the Vietnam Wall Memorial, but I knew nothing about that, and we could talk about the name a little later perhaps. But I was looking for a character who would have the shell shock, battle fatigue that my students had told me about. And for the record, PTSD, post-trauma stress disorder, didn't become current until the mid-'80s. And in many ways it became current because of the second Rambo film, Rambo First Blood Part 2, which was about the POWs and whether they were really there, and the whole controversy about that. And at that time, people began talking about Rambo as a fictional representative of that syndrome. But of course, in Audie's day, there was nothing like that. But I am of an age where I saw Audie Murphy's movies in the theater. I saw To Hell and Back in a theater. And, and I was trying to think the other day if there's another example of a real person who was portrayed in a movie by the actual person. I mean, that's a really unusual, thing to come together. And that had made me read his book, To Hell and Back. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. There's this, I'm reading through, and I was 2 pages past where the tank destroyer is on fire, and the Germans are coming, and he gets on there with the M50, and he's shooting, and he says it so modestly. In the book, it's so modest that I was like 2 pages. I said, wait a minute, what did I just read? And I went back and, oh my God, that was part of the citation for his Medal of Honor. And I got to thinking that he had said in interviews that he wanted to write a second book. And the book would have been the continuation of his story, which is in many ways is more interesting than any of his films, in which he would have told about his struggle to adjust to peacetime. And it never happened. But we know from stories that he had nightmares, that he kept a pistol under his pillow, and he woke up often shooting. And there's a story, he was on location for a movie, and they were in a hotel, he kept putting bullet holes in the hotel wall in the room, and the people on the movie, were trying to. The people would have pictures over the bullet holes so that pretend that none of it ever happened. And we know the story about him being charged with attempted murder because of the incident with the dog trainer who he felt had overcharged. And we know the incident on the movie set where an assistant director belittles Audie's female co-star, and Audie gets the assistant director over and says, if you do that to, she's crying, and he says, if you do that again, I'm going to kill you. And there was something about the depth in his eyes that made it believable. And there are stories, he basically was armed most of the time. And, a troubled man. And so that he became my model. And it's, in terms of the novel, this is his anniversary, right? He died Memorial Day weekend in 1971. And I was finishing the novel, I was almost done with it in 1971, and I remember the shock of the announcement that he had died, and it's in a plane crash, and it seemed ironic that a man who had survived so much violence would die in an act of violence that was how could you know? And I wonder, do you know his citation for the Medal of Honor? Because I have it here if you'd like me to read it to you. It's extraordinary, and I don't want to take up time if it's something that everybody knows.
Yeah, they said go ahead and read it.
Okay. This makes Rambo look like a Boy Scout. This is the official description of the event for which he received the Medal of Honor. Now, there were other events. I'm struck by that his group is pinned down by enemy fire, and he, like Rambo, grabs his weapon and charges up a ravine and actually makes everybody run away. He's so relentless in his attack, single-handedly. But this is the citation. Second Lieutenant Murphy commanded Company B, which was attacked by 6 tanks and waves of infantry. Second Lieutenant Murphy ordered his men to withdraw to a prepared position in a woods, while he remained forward at his command post and continued to give fire directions to the artillery by telephone. Behind him, to his right, one of our tank destroyers received a direct hit and began to burn. Its crew withdrew to the woods. Second Lieutenant Murphy continued to direct artillery fire, which killed large numbers of the advancing enemy infantry. With the enemy tanks abreast of his position, Second Lieutenant Murphy climbed onto the burning tank destroyer, which was in danger of blowing up at any moment, and employed its .50 caliber machine gun against the enemy. He was alone and exposed to German fire from 3 sides, but his deadly fire killed dozens of Germans and caused their infantry attack to waver. The enemy tanks, losing infantry support, began to fall back. For an hour, the Germans tried every available weapon to eliminate Second Lieutenant Murphy, but he continued to hold his position and wiped out a squad that was trying to creep up unnoticed on his right flank. Germans reached as close as 10 yards, only to be mowed down by his fire. He received a leg wound, but ignored it and continued his single-handed fight until his ammunition was exhausted. He then made his way back to his company, refused medical attention, and organized the company in a counterattack, which forced the Germans to withdraw. His directing of artillery fire wiped out many of the enemy. He killed or wounded about 50 of them. Second Lieutenant Murphy's indomitable courage and his refusal to give an inch of ground saved his company from possible encirclement and destruction, and enabled it to hold the woods, which had been the enemy's objective. Now, that's stunning. That's stunning. And it wasn't, as I said, only in that particular event. Counting all the battles in the 9 campaigns that Murphy fought in, he killed at least 250 of the enemy. In another engagement, one of many similar ones, when Murphy's unit was stopped by intense enemy fire, he picked up a light machine gun and stalked up a draw, killing 6 of the enemy, wounding 3 and forcing 5 to surrender. I'm in awe. And so you can see why, when I was working on the book, at any time I thought, is Rambo sort of too much? He's too little. So anyway, that was basically it. And over the years, there have been many people, many military veterans, particularly from the Vietnam War, who have said that they were the model, and it's just not true. Audie Murphy is the guy. Well, that's for Audie.
Yes. What about some other questions out there? You got another one?
He knows this one's coming. Did you have a chance to read
Okay.
the book? Have you had a chance?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes, are you Larry Ann?
No, I'm Melissa. I'm the one that actually
okay.
mailed that to Robert to forward to you.
Oh,
So-
I've read so many. Yes, I have, but I thought Larry Ann Wilkes sent me a book, and I've got several of them. But
Okay.
yes, okay.
All right. So I had, in an email, I had said, if you had known, like you touched on it, Audie's life, after
Yes.
it never got written. Now you know what Audie
Yes.
really did. Can we expect a new book and a new character? And I'm kind
No.
of serious
No.
about that. But otherwise,
No,
too,
but
if you're not up to that, how do you think that Rambo's story might have differed a little bit if you had known that's what Audie had really done to harness his PTSD? Would there have been any changes, do you think, to Rambo?
it gets more complicated, right? Because the book that you sent, Audie Murphy Undercover, right?
Correct.
It doesn't portray him in the way he's usually portrayed, as somebody who is troubled and who is, all the things that I talked about. He seems much more in control. He seems much more dedicated and trying to use his experience to channel it in order to do positive things. So if I had read that book, which wasn't available, it might have clouded my thinking about him, because obviously I'm seeing him in a very limited way. The troubled World War II veteran. But even that portrayal is very important, I think. However, that to have to acknowledge that the cost to what our brave soldiers do, to acknowledge that cost is very important. I'll tell you a story. in 2010, I was part of the first USO tour, authors tour, to a war zone. 5 of us went to Iraq. And
I remember.
before we went to military hospitals in the Washington, D.C. area. And it was perhaps next to, I'll tell you in a moment, my granddaughter, or my son's experience. My son died from cancer, from a rare bone cancer called Ewing sarcoma. And it's pretty bad because it's in the bones. And my granddaughter died from the same disease. And they were both in the hospital for a very long time. And I visited, naturally my son, my granddaughter lived elsewhere, but I visited as I could. And we're talking bad experience. So at the hospital, I was led from room to room for several hours to visit individually. I'm getting a little breathless here. Men who had lost an arm, who had lost 2 arms, who had lost a leg, who had lost 2 legs, who had lost them all. And they were back from Afghanistan or Iraq. And they were going through months and months and months of physical repair to deal with their wounds and to somehow try to make them functional so that they could, get around. And in each of these rooms, because they were there for months, there would be a loved one who was allowed to stay with them in a kind of a chair that folded out into a bed. And usually, I didn't see any men there it was the women. And it was usually either a mother or a wife. And the women were, I remember one of them saying he just had to be a hero, bitterly. But in my conversations with them, they all said they would do it again. And more to the point to me, they all said that they had been motivated to join the military because of the Rambo films. And I said, well, in that case, I guess I bear some responsibility. I didn't write the movies, but I wrote the novel, which is an anti-war novel, but which then promoted the first movie, I think is an anti-war movie, and it's about the anguish of somebody coming back. The later movies tend to be more glorifying. And I remember Sylvester Stallone and I occasionally talk, and when we do, it's for a long time. And when he made the 4th Rambo film, he phoned me one day to tell me what his motives were, and he said that in retrospect, he felt that the 2nd and 3rd Rambo films glorified combat too much, and that he was going to write, direct, and star in a 4th Rambo film, which would be his version of a Sam Peckinpah Rambo film. And if you missed the reference, Sam Peckinpah directed The Wild Bunch in 1969, which had a big influence on me as I wrote First Blood. And he reinvented the Western by making it real. And there had never been an explicitly violent Western like this one. And Sly said, I'm going to do a version of Peckinpah for Rambo as an antidote to the 2nd and 3rd films. So this, I couldn't have had that on my mind, years later, but I'm in this hospital room with these brave men who had, it didn't cost them their lives, but just about, and they're telling me that they would go back, and the power of movies in part. And I said, I guess I have some responsibility. And they said, no, I knew what I was doing. And it's one of the most significant things that have ever happened to me. And I still trying to think through that. I said I became a writer because Sterling Silliphant influenced me, and that I wanted to be an influencer, but I never dreamed that I would be an influencer in the way I just described. Words have consequences and stories have consequences. So anyway, that's a long way of talking about post-trauma stress disorder, and in a way, it was the women in that room who were experiencing it. They even though they'd been there for a very long time, you could see some of them were weeping still, and you could see just the absolute drain that had occurred to them. And my heart went out to them as much as it did to the young men who'd been wounded. So it's a powerful subject, and it's very difficult to get any resolution for. And of course, we experienced, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we still have consequences to the people who were there. So anyway, I probably went on too much against that. If you have another question.
I was going to say, I think we have time for one more question, if there's one more out there. Yes?
Oh my, look at how the time flew by.
So I'm part of a group called Historians at the Movies, and we live tweet movies every Sunday night. Historians all over the country watch different shows and stuff. And so I let them know that I was getting to help out and listen to you tonight. So they're very jealous, for one.
Oh, that's kind of them.
And our fearless leader, because I asked them if they had any questions for you, our fearless leader asked if you were going to kind of rewrite First Blood and it was set in 2023, what's the biggest thing you would have to change?
I wouldn't rewrite it. Although I have a story. Quentin Tarantino, who is one of my idols as a film director, when he was on tour for his book based upon Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, they were talking to him about movies that he, in his fantasy, would want to make, and I was very, very flattered that he said that if he ever did a remake, it would be First Blood, and that he would use the novel, and he referred to the novel in detail, and I was very flattered by it, but I couldn't. First Blood, that book comes out of a unique time in American history where we think we're polarized now. It's nothing compared to the polarization that occurred in 68, 69, 70, and 71. Just one example, and I gather there's a movie that's being prepared about it in the spring of 1970. Students were shot to death at Kent State University by the Ohio National Guard. I mean, just to me, if that had happened in China, there would have been great outrage. But the way it was, it was like forgotten after a while. And to me, that's how bad things got. That the military was shooting Americans who were exercising their First Amendment rights. And the story, the movie, if you only know the movie, it emphasizes Rambo. And the police chief, played wonderfully by Brian Dennehy, is roughly Rambo's age. It's like they're feuding brothers. But the novel has Rambo, a young man coming back from the war, and that was he would have been 20, 21, 22. And the police chief, Teasel, is old enough to be his father. So what we had, and Teasel he'd never had any children, and he wanted children. And this is like the nightmare of the child that he might have had, and Rambo isn't it, and there's a tension between them as a father-son, sort of. And Teasel was a war hero in Korea. so that we have the difference between a conventional combat situation and a guerrilla combat situation. And more than that, Rambo, having come back from the war, is furious about what the war did to him. He is outraged about what it taught him about himself, about his capacity to kill. And so, in a way, he's sort of a war protester. And the police chief, it represents the other side, so to speak. So I saw this as an allegory of the various parts of the country in turmoil, and what is missing in the movie. And I love the movie, so I'm not trying to find fault here, but the novel alternates chapters. We see Teasel from Rambo's point of view. We see Rambo from Teasel's point of view. We go back to Rambo's point of view. We go back to Teasel's point of view, until we don't know who's right, until we're confused about who to cheer for. And there are no heroes in the book. I never thought of it that way. So that at the end, when they finally come together, the reader hopefully is torn apart, because we're so confused. We understand both of them, and maybe condemn both of them as much as we admire both of them. So that the structure of the alternating viewpoints was critical. And people get annoyed with me when I say this, but I can't talk about the movie and the book without it. Rambo dies in the novel. He kills the police chief, and then the man who trained him, Colonel Troutman, kills him. And it's very important to understand that Troutman's first name is Sam. He is Uncle Sam. He is the system that created Rambo and the system that destroyed him. And in some literary critics have said that this is a kind of version of the Frankenstein story, where the scientist creates the being, and what we have is that conflict between them. So the novel, that ending is so essential to an understanding of my view, at least, of what was happening in the United States, and that basically destruction was unless we understood each other. And the novel doesn't have a lot of pontificating about this. The plot basically says it. And anyhow, as I said, it's an allegory, and I would not change it.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
We really, really appreciate you coming on and speaking with us today. I really enjoyed it.
Well, everybody seemed, paying attention, so that's good. Thank you to all for being here and being patient with me.
Yes, definitely wonderful. I think that'll be it for tonight, and I will talk to you again.
Okay, enjoy your evening, and I know you watched the Red Badge of Courage. And I guess you're going to watch a few more. My favorite Audie Murphy is No Name on the Bullet.
That's actually what we're watching next.
It's just him sitting outside that hotel and the town going crazy. Simply because he's there.
Yeah,
I love it.
That's what they'll be watching this evening.
Oh, is that right?
Yes.
Have you seen it? Have they seen it before? I assume.
Probably. Yeah.
It's terrific. It's just, I just have to laugh every time I think about that movie. I'm sitting in that chair. They're killing themselves and they're shooting other people. And you don't have to do anything.
Yes, definitely. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And you guys.
Okay, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Good time.